When the revolution happened, that furthered this split between European Catholicism and American Catholicism. As you might expect, Catholics were very enthusiastically supportive of the revolution. Largely for a couple of reasons. We made alliances with the French, which was a Catholic country, right? So there's that encouragement. The fact that after the revolution there was freedom of religious worship, right? So you could actually worship in public. The fact that you could vote, that you could participate in public life. Right? So there's a lot of reasons Catholics were very supportive of the revolution because of the opportunities that it gave them. And so pre-revolutionary Catholicism separated from public life. Post-revolution, freedom of worship, free without negative consequences, all these kinds of things. But Catholic theology did not have provisions for democratic society. Right? The canon law of Catholicism, the thinking about relationships between church and state, were all shaped by European state churches, the power of the priesthood, all those kind of things. In America, after the revolution, these things are not, they don't exist. So they have unprecedented freedom. And so American Catholics kind of have to create an American Catholic Church without the hierarchical help. Largely because, as well, the Vatican is focused on a lot of things going on in Europe, especially once the French Revolution hits, and then there's some stuff with Spain in the 19th century, and so they're not paying too much attention to the Americas anyway. Which ends up making the American church almost a mystery to the Vatican. They don't really kind of understand it. One of the major figures in all of this change and development is a man named John Carroll. Carroll is a priest, and he dominated a lot of the post-revolutionary scene in shaping American Catholicism. He was an American-born priest, born in Maryland in 1735 to wealthy parents. Is ordained as a Jesuit in Europe later in his life, and stays in Europe for a while, but will return in 1773 to the colonies because the Jesuit order becomes suppressed. The Pope is concerned about Jesuit power and some other things, and so he kind of shuts it down. It'll later be brought back to life. But here he is, a Jesuit. He can't be a Jesuit anymore. Comes to the colonies, becomes very involved. His family does with the Continental Congress. The Congress sends him on a diplomatic mission to Canada. He becomes good friends with Benjamin Franklin. So there is a minor Catholic presence in the founders. So here he is. He's a religious orphan in a sense, right? The church has suppressed his religious order. There's little contact with Roman America. They're dealing with other problems. There's very few Catholics, so let's not worry about it. And so Carroll lays out what he thinks American Catholicism should look like, and this idea receives some support. One of the things he encourages is an American church that's independent of Roman authority, that there would be little Roman control, little Vatican control. He wants it to be just like the colonies, just like the United States. Now, he doesn't want to completely abandon the Pope, but he wants it to be a church that is self-sufficient. Now, we can understand the pragmatics of that, given the new governmental system in the United States, but also any sort of fears Protestants would have would focus on the power of the Pope and the fact that they're beholden to a foreign power. Right? And so by making the American church independent, it's an attempt to try and cut that off, cut off those condemnations. Connected with that, Carroll encouraged that the bishops should be elected, not appointed. The Pope handpicked bishops. Carroll wanted the American priests to get together and elect bishops. Again, it has to do with that foreign power. Here's a foreign power setting up leaders in our country, and so to kind of counteract that suspicion, let's make it a bottom-up, right? The priests in America are going to vote. A third thing Carroll wanted to see was an English liturgy, English worship, where the central ceremonies were conducted in English. The Mass was conducted in Latin. So nobody knew Latin, except for the priests. And so Carroll wanted to see that change and be English and not Latin. He also wanted to see a separate education for Catholics. And he's also instrumental in the beginnings of Georgetown University. And he helps establish that. And so, very interested in separate education. Carroll wanted to see American-born priests, feeling that European priests would offend the American revolutionary mindset. And that's that whole connected to foreign powers thing. He wanted to see, and this is a quote from him, men accustomed to our climate, acquainted to our tempers, our government. And people that know what it's like to be in America. And then finally, he wanted to see a trustee system put in place. Now, many denominations, Protestant denominations in the colonies, had a trustee system where there were individuals, a board of people, more men, who presided over the day-to-day affairs of a church. Responsibility for buying a building, selling property, hiring and firing ministers. They may or may not be like an elder or a religious official, but they had kind of the business responsibilities. Carroll wanted to see that in the Catholic Church. Now, that of course would have given a lot of authority to common Catholics as opposed to priests or bishops. Ultimately, Carroll's vision doesn't last very long. And there are a couple of reasons for that. Well, it eventually gets to the Pope. And the Pope does not like this. Right? And so it's the papacy becomes very immediately opposed to what they call the American experience. This is a renegade group of Catholics. And so they're deeply uncomfortable with some of the things that Carroll is doing. And so they try to force the traditional ways upon them. A second thing that leads to the opposition is the number of foreign-born priests. Most of the priests in Catholicism at the time came from Europe. And ultimately, Carroll decided, I'd rather have a French priest than no priest. But those French priests come with their experience of democracy in the French Revolution, where they're being killed, where they're being forced to swear to the altar of freedom, and so they don't like democracy at all. And so they certainly don't want to see in the church, right? Democracy for a lot of these French priests is about bloodshed, it's about anti-ecclesiasticalism, and so no, not going to be in the church. So ultimately, the Pope insists on appointing bishops. That election thing was overturned almost immediately. Carroll himself is appointed by the Pope as a bishop, and he chooses to accept it. And ultimately, Carroll kind of goes along with a lot of the things that he wants opposed. Some of these things will eventually make their way into it. English worship, for example, a separate educational system. Those things will show back up in later Catholic history. Questions about Catholicism in the colonial period? The last area of practice I want to talk about in the 18th century is music. We've already touched a little bit on this by talking about Charles Wesley, but I want to talk about some other famous hymn writers and hymns of the time. In addition to Charles Wesley, one of the most famous hymn writers of the 18th century is probably Isaac Watts, who wrote around 600 hymns. Songs with titles like "Alas, and did my Savior bleed?" "How shall the young secure their hearts?" "Joy to the world," and "When I survey the wondrous cross." These are just a few of Watts' famous hymns. Watts was a minister, also a scholar of logic and languages, born to dissenters in England. And his father was actually imprisoned early in Watts' life because of being a dissenter. Learned languages very early on. Even in his childhood, he's learning modern languages, but he's also learning especially the classical languages, the languages of the Bible as well. As he becomes a minister, one of his main concerns is he wants to see reform occur in the musical life of the church, in the hymns of the churches. Now, predominantly, he's still a dissenter, so he's more concerned about the dissenting churches. Particularly, he feels like the people's hearts aren't in their singing. Right? Their emotions aren't connected. One of the routes that Watts goes in his hymn writing is to attempt to Christianize the Psalms. The Psalms were a very important part of dissenting worship. And a lot of people just sang the Psalms and felt like the Psalms were the only Psalms because they're divine in worship. For Watts, he felt the Psalms had a specificity that individuals could relate to. These were people, either David or Solomon or Moses or some others, that lived in specific situations, and people could connect with those situations. Right? Songs that were joyous, songs that lamented something. Ultimately, Watts goes through and writes songs out of all of the Psalms except for 12. And there are about 285 additional verses from other Psalms that he felt could not be translated into Christian worship. And so he wants to take the Old Testament Psalms, modify them a little bit, and make them more Christian in some places. One of the things he really wanted to see happen is people make a connection emotionally, but also sing with their understanding. He felt that a lot of the singing that was done in churches, people didn't always understand what was being said. And he emphasized that a song sung by a congregation must be true for it. And if it's not true for the congregants, then it shouldn't be sung. And even though it tells truth, but if they didn't have that connection as well. He also saw his hymns as imitating the Psalms and some of his other hymns, and not always literally translating them. And a lot of his hymns also were meant to take the place of Psalms for unique situations. Right? There are no Psalms that talk about communion, for example, right? Because communion didn't exist when David and others wrote the Psalms. And so he thought, we need to have Psalms that talked about communion. And so he felt there were things like that that were Christian that didn't have an antecedent in Psalms. Interesting, watch this. His new music faced a lot of resistance. Now think about it. In churches today, it's songs like Isaac Watts' songs that people want to hold on to. And this new music is the problem. But when Watts was new, people didn't like his stuff because it was new. Right? So the old stuff now, at one point, was new. And so a lot of people in the 1700s didn't like what Watts was doing to the Psalms. And so he faced a lot of resistance. The traditional practice among the nonconformists, especially the Puritans, was the practice of lining out a psalm, which was done a cappella, but a leader would sing a line from the Psalms, and then the congregation would respond with the same line and sing the same tune. And so this was a means to learn and to remember the Psalms as well as to sing. Watts his songs were imitations of the Psalms, right? And so they weren't specifically the Psalms, so that was a problem. Some nonconformists thought that singing songs invented by human beings not divinely inspired were not appropriate for Christian worship. Right? Christian worship should be songs written by David and other people that wrote the Psalms because God directed them to write it. We shouldn't sing songs made by human beings. In fact, Jonathan Edwards once complained about a church that had adopted the habit of only singing songs by Watts. And so he writes in his diary about, we went to this congregation and they only sang songs by Isaac Watts. Later on, though, a couple of years later, he noted that the practice in his own congregation of incorporating one of Watts' hymns at the conclusion of his singing service and how this was a good thing. So, again, we have that opposition. Watts also wrote hymns for children, none of which apparently remain in use. So most of his major ones are the ones that he writes more for congregations. Some of his songs also became popular in certain slave populations. A lot of the focus in slave music talks about the African influence, right? The spirituals, the ring shouts, some things we'll talk about in the 19th century. But some African slaves also enjoyed Watts' music as well. Again, it was that trying to make sure people understood the lyrics and understood what was being produced. While Watts or Wesley might be the most famous hymnist to come out of the 18th century, perhaps the most famous hymn of the 18th century comes from the pen of John Newton. Amazing Grace, of course, holds a prominent place among Christian hymns and continues to have power even almost 3 centuries after it was written. Newton's mother died early in life, and he follows his father into sea travel. His father was a merchant Navy captain, and so he starts traveling with his father at the age of 11. Eventually he's forced into service in the Royal Navy. He deserted, only to be caught and publicly beaten. He convinced his superiors to move him to a slave ship, to work on a slave ship. And looking back on his life, Newton would later claim that he was more of a deist in thinking and lived an immoral life, despite his mother and his childhood being a Christian and teaching him the Bible. For example, on his first slave ship, he would create obscene poems and songs about the captain and get the crew to sing along. We don't often connect Amazing Grace with that, but here he is making these obscene songs about the ship captain. Eventually he would serve on a variety of slave ships, some of which he was treated very harshly on. He eventually begins reading some devotional material while on his travels, and when caught in a very dangerous storm, he begins rethinking his life and undergoes a type of conversion. He still continues in the slave trade, however, eventually working his way up to captaining his own ship. But he does so from the belief that a Christian slave trader is going to be better for the slaves than other traders who don't have religious convictions. In the 1750s, he moves into an office job, still connected with the slave trade. And he begins to encounter the teachings of the Wesleys, George Whitefield, and really becomes disturbed about the slave trade and decides to quit. So even after his conversion, he's still a slave trader for quite a bit of time. But he gives that up to become an Anglican minister. And once he does, he begins holding a Thursday evening prayer service with some people there from the congregation he is ministering to. And he tries to write a new hymn each week for the service. Many of these hymns that he's writing are Newton's words put to an already familiar tune. Right? So people know the tune, and now they're learning new words. And he ends up writing over 200 of these types of hymns. But the only one you know is Amazing Grace. Right? And so he writes a lot of hymns, but Amazing Grace is the only one that really has an impact. Poet William Cowper was also part of this service, and he too would contribute hymns. And Cowper's known for songs like God moves in a mysterious way, and there is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins. And so both of them are kind of well known for some songs. In 1779, he publishes a song called Faith, Review, and Expectation, written probably around 1772 or 1773. Faith, Review, and Expectation, however, is better known by its opening line, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound. Later in his life, Newton would become very active in the abolitionist cause, particularly with British abolitionist William Wilberforce. And although they're working towards abolition in the 18th century, we're going to focus on abolition when we talk about the 19th century. It's important to note here as we close that contrary to a lot of folk tales, Amazing Grace was probably not related to Newton's thoughts or experiences of slavery's abolition. And he writes it his abolition is after he has left the ministry position when he wrote it. And so while it sounds like a nice story to say he has his conversion, he leaves the slave trade and writes Amazing Grace to protest abolition or to protest slavery, that's not exactly how it works out. Certainly we can see how you can apply those themes, but that's not Newton when he's writing it. We'll finish there with the 18th century. Don't forget to be studying for the midterm. Don't forget as well to turn in the source